Harper Mitchell stared at the elegant card on her kitchen table, the navy blue seal embossed on thick ivory stock catching the slanted morning light. It looked official to ignore. 4 words had summoned her across time and memory. Your presence is requested. No sender, no contact number, no rank. Just the name of the event. USS Truman Anniversary Commemoration, Naval Pier, Norfolk. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up again. It wasn't fear. It was something heavier, a mix of reverence and reluctance. 3 years. That's how long it had been since she last walked a naval deck. Since she had barked orders into the fog of uncertainty. Since she had watched men salute her not because of protocol, but because they trusted her with their lives. She told herself she wouldn't go back. Not ever. But something about that card, it felt less like an invitation and more like a reckoning. She dressed simply. Faded jeans, her gray cardigan with the worn elbows, and the sensible shoes she wore daily to the library job she had taken post-retirement. Her once regal hair was pulled into a loose bun and no makeup adorned her face. There was no effort to impress, but inside her leather purse sat a small, dented metal box. The one she hadn't opened in over a year. The one that still smelled faintly of jet fuel, salt air, and grief. The naval pier was alive with fanfare white tents, velvet ropes, sharp uniforms, and enough designer sunglasses to fund a small air wing. Dignitaries, politicians, and military socialites fluttered around the reception area like overdressed moths. Black SUVs and luxury sedans pulled up in neat succession. Security agents opened doors for women in pearl necklaces and men in gold cufflinks. Every guest received a nod of approval and a practiced smile from the security checkpoint. Then Harper stepped out of a city cab. She didn't match the scene. Her presence created a ripple, a slight but growing discomfort that moved through the crowd like static. A few guests glanced over their shoulders. One woman clutched her Chanel purse a bit tighter. Harper didn't care. Her eyes were locked on the USS Truman, docked just ahead, its steel hull glowing under the morning sun. The flags fluttered along the railings. A Navy band warmed up in the distance. She felt her knees grow weak, not from age or illness, but from memory. Every step forward felt like retracing the past. At the security checkpoint stood Blake Morrison, 32 years old and already insufferable. Dressed in a razor-cut Hugo Boss suit, he looked more like a TV liar than a naval security officer. His hair was slicked back with enough gel to reflect sunlight, and his name badge was polished to a blinding shine. Blake was the son of Norfolk's deputy mayor. Connections got him the position, but ego kept him there. He saw Harper approaching, and his nostrils flared like a hound catching an unfamiliar scent. Blake stepped into her path with theatrical formality. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your invitation." Harper reached into her purse and handed him the card. He glanced at it for no more than a second before frowning, lips tightening into a smirk of barely concealed condescension. "I'm sorry," he said, flipping the card in his hand as if inspecting a counterfeit bill. "Your name isn't on our verified VIP list, which means this might be problematic." He emphasized the last word like a teacher chastising a student for cheating. "You'll need to wait in our verification area until this is sorted out." He pointed to a roped-off space near a supply tent where a few confused-looking guests stood awkwardly. Some were clearly misplaced +1s. Others likely caught in red tape. Harper's face didn't change. No protest, no panic. She simply nodded and walked where directed, clutching her purse a little tighter. Blake watched her go, pleased with himself. As Harper passed the welcome table, something caught her eye. Scale model of the USS Truman, positioned beneath a plexiglass case, admired by guests who clearly had little understanding of what they were looking at. She paused. The radar array, it was facing the wrong direction, pointed southwest instead of northeast. A critical flaw, if replicated on the real ship, would have interfered with coastal communication towers. A rookie mistake, if made during active operations, it could cost lives. Before she could stop herself, Harper stepped forward, opened the case's latch, and gently rotated the radar 15 northeast. Her hand moved with surgical precision. A breath escaped her lips. 15 degrees northeast. Avoid signal shadow from the Norfolk Tower. The nearby guests went silent. A woman in a navy blue cocktail dress blinked, startled. A man in a blazer whispered something to his wife. A young enlisted sailor tilted his head, puzzled. Blake, still watching from a distance, stormed over. "Oh, wonderful," Blake said loudly, clapping his hands with sarcastic glee. "We've got ourselves a radar expert here. Maybe you should be giving the speeches today, ma'am." Several guests chuckled uncomfortably. Harper looked up. Her face was calm, unblinking. Her voice, when it came, was like a steel cable stretched tight. "I walked these decks when no one else dared." The laughter died instantly. Blake's smile faltered, but he doubled down. "I'm sure you did. Maybe in a tour group, or one of those Women of the Navy tribute videos, huh?" That last jab earned him a laugh from a local businessman in aviators. Harper didn't respond. She turned her gaze toward the ship, jaw tight, her thumb running across the leather handle of her purse. A wealthy donor nearby scoffed. "These days everyone watches a war doc and thinks they're combat veterans." The silence that followed felt dangerous. From beneath Harper's feet, the deck of the pier began to echo with sound boots, whistles. Commands. High above on the USS Truman, a whistle blasted across the bay. Then another. And then the unmistakable sound of every sailor aboard snapping to attention. Full salute. Uniform rose. Even the brass band fell silent. The air shifted. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses of champagne froze halfway to lips. The string quartet in the reception tent trailed off awkwardly. The only sound was the salt-sprayed wind tugging at flags and dress uniforms. Every sailor aboard USS Truman had gone rigid, a synchronized salute, facing the pier, standing in perfect unison. No call had been made. No announcement from the speaker system. The deck simply responded to an unseen authority. Blake looked up at the ship, bewildered. What the hell? And then the moment escalated. A normal Navy procession descended the gangplank, 4 officers in white dress uniforms, leading the way for a man whose face was unmistakable to anyone who knew anything about the Calteting, U.S. Navy, Rear Admiral Jonathan Keene. The Admiral strode toward the pier with his cover tucked beneath, his arm and his jaw set in a grim line of purpose. He did not acknowledge the crowd or the dignitaries. His eyes were locked on one person, Harper Mitchell. Blake stepped forward, forcing a smile and raising his badge as if the Admiral needed identification. "Sir, can I help you verify this guest? She's not on the list. Maybe Miss." Keene didn't glance at him, didn't even blink. He walked directly to Harper, stopped 2 feet from her, and gave a formal Navy salute, the kind reserved for the highest honors. The silence broke like a levee. Gasps, audible. Confusion. A collective intake of breath from civilians and sailors alike. "Commander Harper Mitchell," Keene said loud enough for the entire pier to hear, "permission to welcome you aboard the Truman, your ship." Harper's shoulders relaxed. Her hand rose in return, and her voice, though quiet, carried like a whip crack. "Permission granted." Keene nodded once, then turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Keene began, now addressing the entire reception, "allow me to introduce a woman most of you never knew, but every one of you should remember." He turned slightly toward Harper, who remained still, composed. "This is Commander Harper J. Mitchell, United States Navy, retired. Former commanding officer of the USS Truman during Operation Iron Vow. A career officer. decorated for valor, strategic excellence, and unwavering service. The whispers turned into stunned silence. Her leadership brought this vessel and her crew home after sustaining catastrophic systems damage during a blackout in hostile waters. While the fleet fell back, she advanced. While others hesitated, she acted. Keen's voice cracked, just barely, as he added, "She saved over 400 lives. And she never asked for recognition." Blake stumbled backward, the blood draining from his face. Everything Blake Morrison thought he understood collapsed in seconds. He had mocked a woman who had led in war, who had commanded the very vessel everyone was here to honor, who had stood face to face with death and didn't blink, and he had treated her like a trespasser. He tried to retreat quietly into the crowd, but eyes followed him. A ripple of disgust spread through the spectators. Whispers sharpened. Some shook their heads. Others pulled their phones out not to check messages, but to record the moment. He looked at Harper, his mouth opening, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but she didn't acknowledge him. She simply looked past him, as if he were just one more forgettable bureaucrat in a long line of unearned authority. And for the first time in his life, Blake Morrison felt completely powerless. Rear Admiral Keen extended a hand toward Harper's shoulder. "You brought it, didn't you?" Harper nodded slowly and reached into her purse. With both hands, she removed the small metal box, setting it down on the memorial podium positioned beside the ship's ceremonial bell. The hush across the crowd deepened. Even the seagulls seemed to quiet. Harper clicked open the latch. Inside colon, a folded American flag, edges frayed slightly from years of handling, a single silver dog tag, dulled with age, a faded photograph of two young officers, side by side. One was Harper, the other a man with a bright grin and kind eyes. She held the photo up with shaking hands. "This," she said, her voice steady but laced with reverence, "is Lieutenant Michael Trent, my second in command. My friend. He didn't make it home." She swallowed hard. "This box was the last thing I carried off the Truman before I resigned my commission. I didn't think I'd ever return. But Admiral Keen sent me this invitation, and I knew this was the place. The only place it belongs." She turned, handed the dog tag to Keen, and placed the flag gently into the ship's memorial chamber, a silent, sacred space aboard the vessel honoring the fallen. "I carried him with me long enough," Harper whispered. And for a moment, the crowd wasn't full of elite donors and self-important guests. It was filled with people simply watching history unfold, a quiet, graceful act of remembrance that none of them had earned the right to witness. As Harper stood before the memorial chamber, the flag tucked carefully inside, a quiet reverence took over the gathering. No one moved. Not even the cameras dared to flash. It was as though time had slowed, pulling everyone into the moment with a magnetic force. The crowd remained at a respectful distance, observing the woman who had commanded a warship during a time of unimaginable pressure, saving lives while others made excuses. When Harper turned to Admiral Keen, it wasn't to ask for praise or recognition. It was to complete something personal, a piece of her past that had never felt finished. "Admiral," she said softly, her voice cracking ever so slightly, "I never thought I'd come back here. After all the loss, after everything we went through, I thought it would be easier to just walk away." Keen nodded, understanding more than anyone could. He had known Harper long enough to understand that this wasn't about pride. It wasn't about personal glory. It was about closure. "That's why I invited you," Keen said, his voice low but firm. It was never about ceremony. It was about remembering not just the ship, but the people who made it what it was. Harper paused. The weight of his words settled over her, heavy with understanding. The USS Truman had been her responsibility, her command, but she had never truly left it. She had carried it with her every day since her resignation. "Thank you, Admiral," she said, her eyes briefly glancing down at the box, "for bringing me home." Keene stepped back, giving Harper the space to address the crowd. This was her moment, not for accolades, but for one last lesson. One final word to the people who had underestimated her and her place in this world. She faced the crowd, her voice strong, though her eyes glimmered with emotion. "It's strange," she began, her hands resting at her sides, "how some people are quick to judge, quick to dismiss. They think leadership is defined by suits, titles, or connections. They think respect comes from status, from wealth, from appearances." She looked directly at Blake, who stood uncomfortably off to the side, avoiding her gaze. "Respect isn't given to those who demand it. It's earned. It's earned in the quiet moments when the world is unsure, when the fight is hard, and when the cost is more than you can bear. That's when respect is earned." The room fell into a heavy silence, everyone listening intently to the woman who had commanded their very thoughts with just a few words. "You'll find, eventually, that no one cares how many awards you wear or how expensive your shoes are," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "What matters is who you are when no one's watching, what you've done, what you've sacrificed." She paused as if choosing her final words carefully. "Thank you for remembering. But I'm done now." She turned toward the ship, taking a deep breath. Blake Morrison had never felt smaller in his life. Standing there in his pristine suit, surrounded by the wealth and privilege of Norfolk's elite, he suddenly realized the magnitude of the miscalculation he'd made earlier. His attempt to assert power over Harper, mocking her in front of everyone, had not only failed but had humiliated him in the process. People in the crowd weren't just talking about her. They were looking at him, whispering behind their hands, pointing out his arrogance. The wealthiest men and women who had arrived expecting to rub elbows with the city's top names were now turning their backs to him. Blake's pride had driven him to judge someone based on appearances, on the faded cardigan, the simple jeans, the lack of pomp and ceremony. But that's not where respect lived. Not at all. He tried to make eye contact with Harper, but she never looked back. There was a knot in his stomach as he realized what he had done. He had misjudged the one person who commanded authority in that room. As Harper took her first steps away from the memorial chamber, the crowd parted like the sea, but it wasn't to let her through. It was to stand at attention. First, it was the sailors. Every single one of them, uniformed, stoic, standing tall, saluted the woman who had once stood beside them in battle. The solemn respect radiated from them, their eyes unwavering, their salutes sharp and full of honor. Then came the civilians. Slowly at first, but then with a growing sense of realization and respect, the elites, the politicians, and the business owners followed suit. They stood in unison, saluting a woman they had never understood until now. The crowd wasn't clapping, but every single person was paying their dues in the only way they could, with respect. Blake Morrison stood frozen in place, caught in the middle of the silence. A single tear welled up in his eye, but he refused to let it fall. He would never forget this day. He would never forget the woman he had tried to belittle and the way she had turned the tables with nothing but her dignity. Without a word, Harper Mitchell left the pier. Her exit was silent. No applause, no final wave. She didn't need validation. She didn't need anyone's approval. The wind tugged at her cardigan, the flag of the USS Truman still echoing in her chest. She was complete, and yet there was a weight lifted, a burden released that only someone who had been through the fire could understand. Harper's steps were measured, deliberate. She did not turn back to see the crowd. She didn't need to, because she knew, with every part of her being, that she had already won.